They left me tied to the radiator, whispering as they pulled the knot tight. "She won't move anyway." They thought I couldn't hear them clearly, but the words crawled inside me like insects, chewing at my dignity, and they never left. I felt the metal press against my skin, cold and familiar, because it was the same radiator where I had once leaned in winter to warm my grandchildren's mittens after school. The same iron ribs that had held the heat of soups and stories, now turned into a post to tether me like a restless animal. I remember trying to breathe slowly so I wouldn't sob, because if I sobbed, they would think I was weak, and if I was weak, they would feel justified in what they had done. I remember my son's shoes, polished but scuffed at the edges, moving quickly across the linoleum, his voice lowered as if shameful. "Don't worry, she won't get far." And then the door closing. Silence, just me, the radiator, and the echo of a life that had narrowed into captivity in the very house where once I had been queen of every small ritual. I am 78 years old, though sometimes I feel older, as if every humiliation adds another year onto my bones. I live alone now, in a small apartment above a bakery that smells of yeast and cinnamon every morning. The landlady is deaf in one ear and never asks questions. Perhaps she recognizes that older women are full of stories that can be unbearable to listen to. I sit most evenings near the window and look out at the buses coughing down the street. And I think about how easily people can vanish into ordinary days. When I walk to the market, no one knows that once I was tied to a radiator by the very people who should have defended me from coldness, from shame, from anything that resembled cruelty. To the grocer, I am another old lady choosing apples too carefully. To the bus driver, I am another discounted ticket. To the world, I am invisible. But to myself, I am still the woman who remembers the scrape of cords on her wrists, the dull ache of waiting for someone to untie her, the astonishment when it was not family who came back, but strangers in heavy boots. With flashlights and clipped professional voices saying, "Ma'am, are you hurt?" That was the day I learned something irreversible. The people you carry on your back will eventually climb down, not to thank you, but to trample you once you stumble. I think back on my life and wonder how many small silences prepared me for that moment. The times I didn't answer back when my daughter-in-law dismissed me with a wave of her manicured hand. The times I let my son make decisions about my bank account, just to keep things simple. The times I accepted being told to sit in the back seat, to keep quiet at dinners, to stay in the house instead of walking alone, because what if she gets confused? Every concession, every polite smile, every swallowing of anger was a thread, and the day they tied me to the radiator was simply the moment the net closed. I had given them the ropes long before they used them. I tell you this not because I enjoy the drama of victimhood, but because truth is quieter and heavier than performance. The truth is that I knew it was possible. I had seen little warnings, subtle cruelties that most people would dismiss as impatience. The overpatient tone my son used when speaking to me, like he was soothing a child instead of addressing the woman who had once fed him through sickness, scraped her hands raw at work to pay his tuition, and held his head after his father's funeral. The way my daughter-in-law sighed when I entered a room, her smile tightening like an elastic band stretched too thin. I told myself it was stress, that young families have pressures I had forgotten, that I should be grateful for a roof, for company, for not being entirely alone. Gratitude became my leash, and they knew it. The day of the radiator was not a day of fire or emergency. It was ordinary. That was the worst part. The morning light came through the kitchen window like always. I had buttered toast like always. I folded dish towels like always. But by afternoon, their irritation had reached that hidden threshold, the one where they no longer cared to disguise their feelings. "She wanders," my daughter-in-law said, though I had not wandered farther than the porch in years. "She could fall," my son added, though the only thing I had stumbled over were their careless words. They spoke over me, never to me, arranging my fate like decorators shifting furniture. And then came the suggestion, half a joke perhaps, except it was not funny at all. Better tie her down so she doesn't get into trouble. And when they did it, when they looped that cord around my wrist and through the radiator pipe, there was no hesitation, no apology, just efficiency, just dismissal. And so there I sat, feeling my body become smaller, my memory sharper. I thought of the years when that radiator had been my ally against cold, when I had dried socks, defrosted hands, listened to the hum of pipes like an old friend whispering warmth. Now it hissed beside me with indifference, holding me captive not by its own will, but by the will of blood who had grown tired of blood. I whispered to myself then quietly, so no one would hear, "Remember this." Because memory is all we old women have when the world decides our usefulness has expired. When the firefighters came, breaking the lock after a neighbor had called about smoke from a pan forgotten on the stove, they found me upright, composed, as if I had been expecting them. One of them, a boy no older than my grandson, crouched down to cut the cord and said gently, "Who did this to you, ma'am?" And I almost lied. I almost said it was an accident, that I had tangled myself because shame is a strange companion and it urges silence. But then I looked at him, at his unlined face, his assumption that grown sons protect their mothers, not bind them, and I said nothing. My silence was answer enough. He nodded, and I knew he understood. They helped me stand, checked my pulse, asked if I had family to call. And I heard my own voice, steady but hollow, say, "No." That was the truest word I had spoken in years. Now, when I sit in this apartment and hear the radiator hiss in winter, I touch my wrist unconsciously and feel both the ghost of rope and the ghost of freedom. I am not naive enough to believe that I will ever forget, but I am old enough to know that remembering can also be a form of survival. I am 78. I live alone, and I am not tied to anything anymore except my own stubborn will to live in truth, even if it is bitter, even if it is lonely. And perhaps that is better than being surrounded by family who can look at the woman who raised them and whisper, "She won't move anyway," as if I were already dead. The defining moment came not when the cord bit into my skin, nor when the door shut behind them, but later, when a uniformed woman with a clipboard in her hand confirmed in plain words what I had already felt in my bones. They had left me behind on purpose. She spoke with the flat calm of someone used to delivering unwelcome truths, the way a nurse informs you that the test results are not what you hoped for, or a clerk explains that the account you thought was shared has only one name on it, and it is not yours. She asked me my son's full name, tapped it into her little device, paused long enough to let pity rise in her eyes, then said, "Yes." He signed. "Discharge instructions at 2:15 this afternoon. He and his wife are listed as responsible parties. They acknowledge that you were secured at home for your safety while they traveled to an event. I'm sorry, but that's what the record shows." Those words, "secured at home," were a knife disguised as paperwork, an official label for what I knew in my heart to be abandonment. Secured meant tied, confined, silenced. Safety meant convenience for them, not dignity for me. In that moment, the fog lifted. There was no misunderstanding, no slip of memory, no exaggeration on my part. It was intentional. It was betrayal with a signature at the bottom. I stood there, the clipboard light reflecting off the linoleum, and realized that my whole life had been preparing me for this kind of quiet exclusion, the sort that doesn't scream or strike, but erases you with polite phrasing. I thought back to other times when they had done it, not so crudely, but with the same logic. When they invited friends for dinner and asked me to stay in my room because you must be tired. When they corrected me in front of strangers as if my voice were a wandering child that needed to be put back in line. When they rearranged my medications without telling me so, that I would stop asking questions. Each time I told myself it was a small thing, not worth breaking the fragile glass of family peace, but small things accumulate like dust until one day the house is suffocating. The radiator was not a single cruel act out of nowhere. It was the harvest of years of silences I had offered them in good faith. When I tried to explain this to the young man who had untied me, my words came out halting, not because I was confused, but because I could see disbelief creeping into his expression. He had grown up in a world where mothers are put on pedestals on Mother's Day, where sons bring flowers, where daughters-in-law smile in holiday photos. He had not yet lived long enough to see how love can curdle into resentment, how care can become a performance for neighbors, how convenience can masquerade as safety. I looked at him and saw that he did not know the depth of betrayal, not yet, but someday he would. Someday, when someone he trusted chose comfort over loyalty, he would remember the old woman by the radiator who whispered, "They meant it." I did not collapse into tears, though a part of me wanted to weep until my throat bled. I sat upright, folded my hands on my lap, and let the truth settle. Betrayal has a weight, a very specific weight, heavier than grief, because grief at least honors the value of what was lost. But betrayal mocks it, denies it, rewrites it, as if your sacrifices had always been a mistake. I remembered the long nights working double shifts at the hospital when my son was a child, my knees aching, my back screaming, the paycheck barely enough to cover his shoes and books. I remembered the meals skipped so he could eat more, the birthday parties where I baked cakes from scratch and pretended not to notice when other parents looked down on us. I remembered the way I cheered at his graduation, the pride so overwhelming it felt like my heart might burst, and how I told myself it was all worth it. And now here I was, labeled as secured at home, a phrase cold enough to be carved into a gravestone. All those sacrifices had not built love, only entitlement. The most brutal realization was not that they abandoned me, but that I had known they were capable of it and had done nothing to stop it. I had ignored the signs because to face them earlier would have meant admitting that the son I raised with every ounce of my strength had grown into a man who could look at his own mother and see not a person, but a burden to be managed. I had hoped against hope that decency would restrain them, that the bond of blood would act as some invisible rope stronger than the one around my wrist. But I was wrong. Blood is not a bond. It is merely an accident. Character is the bond, and theirs was paper thin. When the official left, leaving me with pamphlets about senior resources that felt like a condolence prize, I sat in the empty room and listened to the hum of the radiator. I could still feel the rough indentation on my skin where the cord had been, but the deeper mark was inside, a wound without blood. For the first time, I admitted to myself that I was no longer safe among my own kin, and that admission, though terrifying, was strangely clarifying. If they could do this once, they could do it again. If they could sign a paper that turned my captivity into a technicality, they could sign others that would strip me of everything else. It was not paranoia, it was recognition. I thought then about how betrayal often arrives, not like thunder, but like paperwork, quiet, official, polite. I thought about how women like me are always told to be grateful, to be cooperative, to avoid making scenes, and how that obedience is the soil where such betrayals grow fat and tall. I realized that my silence had been their greatest ally, and that if I wanted to survive as myself rather than as an object, I would have to break that silence. The radiator was the catalyst, the point of no return. It turned every memory sharp, every gesture clear. I could not go back to pretending, not after hearing my own son's voice dismiss me as if I were luggage left behind. That night, I lay in bed, not tied, but still restless, my wrists throbbing with the memory. I stared at the ceiling and whispered to the dark, I will remember. I will not forgive. I will not let this be the end of me. It was not a vow of revenge, though part of me longed for it. It was a vow of clarity. The betrayal had stripped away the illusion, and clarity, even when cruel, is a kind of freedom. From that night forward, I would measure every decision, every step, against the truth that had finally revealed itself. They had left me, not by mistake, not out of carelessness, but by choice. And once you know you are disposable to the people you love most, you must decide whether to become truly disposable, fading into silence, or whether to rise, scarred but unbroken, and claim the fragments of dignity still within reach. I chose that night to rise. After that day, the cruelty did not arrive in dramatic waves, but seeped in like water under a closed door, invisible at first, almost deniable, until suddenly the whole floor is soaked and you realize it has been happening for much longer than you allowed yourself to see. The radiator had been the visible act, the headline of betrayal. But the real escalation unfolded in smaller details, in the quiet routines that became cages, in the subtle erasures that did not scream, but whispered me out of existence. They never tied me again, no. They were too clever for that. But they began to bind me with softer cords, the kind that no outsider would notice and no official could record. They took away my keys, first claiming it was for my safety, that I might drop them or leave the door unlocked, then later not even bothering with excuses, simply keeping them out of sight so that the house no longer belonged to me in any tangible way. I was a guest in the space where once I had been the anchor. They controlled the thermostat, deciding when I should be warm, when I should feel cold, even when I could cook, because the kitchen, they said, became too messy when I used it. Imagine being told that the room where you had stirred stews and baked loaves for decades, the room where you had fed a family through poverty and illness, was now forbidden to you because your chopping board was too worn or your spices too dated. I would sit at the table, silent, while my daughter-in-law swirled sauces from jars and placed them into pans like a performance, while my son nodded along as if efficiency had replaced nourishment. They never asked if I wanted to eat what was served. They plated food and slid it toward me as one does for a dog, perfunctory, without thought for taste or appetite. And then they looked past me to their own conversations. The house grew quieter for me, though it remained noisy for them. I noticed how their laughter softened when I entered a room, how conversations trailed off into polite nothings, how their eyes avoided mine as if direct contact might remind them that I was still here, still a person. They spoke about schedules, soccer practice, new appliances, vacations, but never included me, not even with a question or a comment, as though my presence might tarnish the brightness of their carefully polished lives. When neighbors dropped by, I was instructed with a look, not words, to stay in my room or to keep my remarks short. Once I overheard my son telling a neighbor that I was not really up to socializing anymore, that I tired easily, though I had not said such a thing. To the outside world, I was being rewritten as fragile, confused, dependent. And because they controlled the narrative, no one doubted it. I became a ghost in the very house I had paid for. My history erased by their comfort with the lie. Worse than the silence were the small humiliations designed to shrink me further. My clothes were sometimes accidentally mixed into donation bags so that when I went to my dresser, an old sweater or a familiar blouse would be missing. They claimed it was for decluttering, that I should not hold on to unnecessary things, but each missing garment felt like a theft of memory, a quiet stripping away of layers that had once protected me. My books disappeared from shelves, replaced by glossy picture frames that contained none of my face. Even the little porcelain figurines, cheap trinkets I had collected over years because they made me smile, vanished one by one until the shelves reflected only their taste, their story, their version of a home. I said nothing, because to protest would have meant confrontation, and confrontation was their favorite evidence that I was difficult. And so I stayed silent, which was exactly what they wanted, until my silence grew so loud in me it almost deafened. The children, my grandchildren, mirrored what they saw. They no longer came to me with their small problems or their silly jokes. They passed me in hallways with polite nods, as though I were an elderly tenant, someone unrelated. Once, the younger one looked at me curiously and asked, "Grandma, why don't you ever come with us?" Before I could answer, my daughter-in-law interjected, "Because Grandma needs to rest, darling. She gets tired too easily." I wanted to shout then, to say I was not tired, that I could still walk, still laugh, still matter. But the words dried in my throat. Children believe what they are told, and he nodded, satisfied with her explanation, and ran off to his game. That small exchange was another tightening of the invisible cords, binding me to an image I did not choose. I started to withdraw, not because I wished to, but because resistance seemed futile. I would sit by the window and watch the street as if it were a stage where other lives were performed. People carried groceries, walked dogs, laughed on their phones, and I realized with a pang that none of them knew. The woman inside the house staring out was being slowly erased. I felt myself thinning, as though I were turning into smoke. Sometimes I would press my palms hard against my thighs just to remind myself I was still solid, still here, because the way they moved around me, the way they looked through me, suggested otherwise. I began to doubt even my own perceptions. Perhaps I was making too much of it. Perhaps I was old and paranoid. But then I would remember the radiator, the cord, the whisper. She won't move anyway. And the doubt would vanish. That moment was real, and if that was real, then everything else I sensed was real too. The cruelty was in the consistency. Day after day, the small dismissals stacked like bricks. My son corrected me when I spoke about the past, saying, "That's not how it happened, Mom," as though my memories were fabrications. My daughter-in-law sighed when I asked simple questions, her sighs long enough to fill the room with annoyance. They checked my pill bottles in front of me, counted tablets as though I were a child playing with marbles. They locked the car and pocketed the keys so I would not wander. They stopped telling me about bills, about mail, about anything that mattered. I was living in the house, but outside of its decisions, present in body, but erased in voice. And with every erasure, I felt the part of me that had once been fierce, resilient, resourceful, shrink back a little farther, curling into some small corner of my chest where they could not reach. At night, when the house was finally quiet, I would lie awake and hear the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of pipes, the distant cars, and I would think about how easy it would be to let myself disappear completely, to stop resisting, to stop caring, to let their version of me become reality. Old, tired, fragile, irrelevant. And yet, some stubborn ember inside refused. Perhaps it was pride, perhaps anger, perhaps simply the knowledge that I had survived harder years than this. I had survived poverty, widowhood, long nights alone with sick children, cruel bosses, the slow erosion of my own body. I had not done all that just to become a shadow tied to a radiator or erased from family photographs. But still, the weight of the days pressed harder, and I felt my back bending, not from age alone, but from the accumulation of being told I did not count. The escalation was quiet, almost elegant in its cruelty. No shouting, no blows, just the steady peeling away of myself until I was a husk, moving through rooms I no longer recognized. And yet, even as I shrank, I kept listening, kept storing details, kept remembering. Because I knew somewhere deep that memory itself might one day be my weapon, that the very act of witnessing my own erasure was an act of resistance. They could silence me in the moment, but they could not control what I held inside, and what I held inside was the truth. The shift did not arrive with thunder or revelation, but with the quiet touch of a stranger's hand and the blunt honesty of a question no one in my family had dared to ask. It was the fireman, the same boy who had crouched by my side to cut the cord from my wrist, who looked at me not as an inconvenience or a fragile relic, but as someone in need of truth. And he asked, "Do you have someone safe to call?" I opened my mouth to speak my son's name, but the syllables tasted rotten, heavy with betrayal. So I closed it again. For a moment I considered lying, because pride insists on keeping the facade intact. But then something stronger than pride forced me to answer honestly, and I whispered, "No." The sound of that word startled me more than any alarm bell could have. It was not just an admission about that night. It was the verdict of my whole life as it had unfolded into this moment. I had no one safe to call. Not my son, not his wife, not even the grandchildren who had already begun to look through me like I was made of glass. That single word, "no," was the crack that let light in. Because once I said it out loud, I could no longer pretend otherwise. And without the pretense, I was suddenly freer than I had been in years. In the days that followed, I kept turning that moment over in my mind, examining it the way one examines a bruise to see how deep it goes. No one safe. What does it mean to be 78? And to realize safety must now come from yourself alone. It means the house that once sheltered you has become a cage. The family that once drew breath from your sacrifices has turned that breath into smoke. The life you thought you had built around loyalty has become a hollow stage set that collapses as soon as you lean on it. For years, I had convinced myself that staying quiet, keeping peace, not demanding too much, was the way to preserve love. But love cannot survive on obedience alone. My silence had not preserved anything. It had only fattened their sense of ownership over me. Once I saw that clearly, I began to shift. I stopped waiting for kindness from them and began to imagine kindness from elsewhere, or even just from myself. The shift began in the smallest acts, so minor anyone else would have missed them. One morning, when my daughter-in-law told me to stay inside because the air was damp and not good for my bones, I waited until they left and then stepped out onto the porch anyway, letting the dampness settle on my skin like proof that I was still capable of choosing. Another day, when they served dinner without asking what I wanted, I quietly hid a few coins in my pocket and bought myself a pastry from the corner bakery the next morning, eating it slowly in the park like it was a feast. These were not rebellions that would make headlines, but for me, they were declarations, private confirmations that I still belonged to myself in small ways. Each secret act built upon the last, and little by little, I began to imagine a life that did not revolve around waiting for their permission. One evening, I sat by the window, watching the buses roll past, and I remembered the woman I used to be before marriage, before motherhood, before decades of service and compromise. I remembered a room I once rented as a young bride, nothing more than a mattress and a chipped dresser, but it had been mine, and no one told me what to eat or when to speak. I remembered how I once walked through city streets with a head held high, not because I had power, but because I had possibility. Those memories rose in me like ghosts, and instead of mourning them, I began to use them as blueprints. I told myself, if I had once built a life from nothing, I could build again, even at 78. Age is not an erasure of agency unless you allow it to be. The turning point solidified when I went to the pharmacy alone under the excuse of picking up ointment. For the first time in months, I was out without their eyes on me, and I lingered by the bulletin board near the counter. Among the advertisements for babysitters and piano lessons, I saw a handwritten note. Room for rent, private, quiet, safe, call Joyce. My heart knocked so loudly I thought the clerk might hear it. I copied down the number on the back of a receipt and tucked it deep in my pocket. That scrap of paper burned against my thigh the whole walk home, not because I had yet decided to act, but because it symbolized that I could act. For the first time since the Radiator, I felt possibility stretch before me like a road. That night in bed, I pressed the paper flat under my pillow and whispered, "Soon." I did not know exactly when. I did not know what it would cost me. But I knew that the shift had already happened. I was no longer someone waiting to be untied. I was someone planning how to walk away. The past has a way of refusing to stay buried, even when you think you have walked far enough to lose it in the fog of distance. And so it was with me. Because just when I had begun to taste the first small fragments of freedom, when the scraps of independence I had gathered in secret felt like the start of a new existence, the shadows of what I left behind came crawling back with sharper claws, as if to test whether my resolve was real or only a passing flicker. It began with a letter slid under the door of my apartment in a plain envelope without a return address, the kind of envelope that already carries menace before you open it. And when I unfolded the paper, I recognized the handwriting instantly. My grandson, Kieran, the only one who had ever looked at me as though I were more than a burden, the only one who used to sit beside me and ask questions that mattered. His words were short, awkward, almost hurried, but behind them I could feel the tremor of genuine worry. "Grandma, they say you disappeared. Dad is angry. Mom is crying. No one knows where you are. I miss you. Please let me know you are okay. My hands shook as I read it, not from frailty, but from the sudden surge of conflicting emotions. Because here was proof that not everyone had forgotten me. Not everyone had signed my silence away. Yet here, too, was the reminder that my escape had not gone unnoticed, that they had already begun rewriting the story of my absence, and in their version, I was not a woman who had chosen to leave, but an old lady who had wandered off confused, creating chaos for those who loved her. That letter was a thread pulling me back, but it was also a mirror forcing me to ask myself whether my new life could ever truly belong only to me if pieces of my heart still lived in the old house. I folded the paper carefully and tucked it into the drawer, telling myself I would not respond. Not yet. Because to answer too soon would give them power. But the words lingered inside me. And every time I looked out at the street or past the park, where children played, I thought of Kieran and the afternoons when he would sit on the floor beside me building toy houses, while I told him stories about his father as a boy. Stories his father never wanted repeated. I knew then that the second escalation had begun, not in the form of ropes or signatures this time, but through the softer weapon of guilt, the kind that seeps through bloodlines and makes you doubt the clarity of your own choices. It did not stop with the letter. Days later, as I wiped down tables at the small cafe where I had found part-time work, I saw her face reflected in the glass of the front door. My daughter-in-law, Lisa, standing stiffly as though she did not belong among the cracked linoleum and cheap coffee smell, her coat too fine for this neighborhood, her posture too rigid, her expression unreadable. She hovered near the pastry display, pretending to study muffins. But I knew she was waiting for me. I could have hidden in the kitchen, could have let her leave, but something inside me hardened, and I walked to her slowly, my apron still tied, my hair damp with steam, my hands smelling faintly of dish soap. She turned, and her eyes widened as if she had seen a ghost, then quickly softened into the smile she used at dinner parties, the one that meant diplomacy rather than warmth. "Martha," she said, voice low. I answered evenly, "Lisa." She asked if we could talk privately, and I gestured to a booth in the back, not because I wanted to, but because I refused to let her believe I was afraid. We sat across from each other like enemies negotiating a fragile truce. She began with excuses, telling me they panicked, that the flight was boarding, that the children were restless, that they thought I was behind them. I let her speak, and when she finished, I simply said, 8 hours, Lisa. 8 hours I waited, and no one looked for me. Not at the gate, not in the lounge, not anywhere. You knew what you were doing. Her face tightened, the mask cracking for a moment, and she whispered, "I didn't think you'd leave." My voice was steady when I answered, "I didn't." You did. Silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, until she reached into her purse and slid an envelope across the table. She claimed it was something from Kieran, that he wanted me to have it, and though I doubted her motives, I took it. Because sometimes survival means accepting the object, even when you reject the hand. Her visit was not the end, but the beginning of their campaign to reclaim me. A week later, a man in a gray suit appeared outside the cafe, waiting for me to finish my shift. He introduced himself as Derek Sorensen, attorney representing my son and his wife, sent to ensure my well-being and to discuss future arrangements. I looked him in the eye and said, "Tell Adam and Lisa I am not a pet they forgot to pick up. My well-being is excellent, and my future is mine." He cleared his throat, spoke of assets and safety, and I walked past him without another word, leaving him blinking in the weak sunlight. That was when I knew they were not simply worried. They were strategizing, preparing to draw me back into their control by legal means if necessary. It was another escalation, a more sophisticated one, dressed in concern but sharpened by greed and the hunger to dictate my narrative. The worst of it came in the form of a newspaper article mailed to me in a thick envelope, a clipping from my old hometown's community section. The headline read, "Missing Matriarch. Family Seeks Answers." There was my photograph, taken years ago at some family gathering, smiling without teeth, holding a pie dish. The article quoted Adam, "We are deeply worried." She vanished without a word. "We just want her safe." Lisa added, "She is vulnerable. We fear something happened. She's not the type to do something like this." I laughed when I read those words, a sharp bark that startled even me, because never in my life had I felt less vulnerable than the moment I walked away. Never had I been more certain that I was exactly the type to do something like this once pushed too far. Yet here they were, performing concern for the public, painting themselves as victims of my disappearance, rewriting the truth until strangers would pity them and suspect me of confusion or madness. That article was an assault far deeper than the cord on my wrist, because it was aimed not at my body, but at my identity, seeking to erase the version of me that had chosen, that had acted, that had broken free. I sat with the clipping in my hands, shaking not from fear, but from the magnitude of their audacity. To erase a woman's story is to kill her twice, once in the act itself and once in the telling afterward. They wanted me gone. But if I would not vanish quietly, then they would sculpt a version of me that justified their abandonment, and that version would circulate in whispers, in headlines, in the polite sympathy of neighbors. That was the escalation. Not just tying me to a radiator, but tying me to a lie. And yet, even as their tactics multiplied, something inside me had grown too strong to bend. Each attempt to reclaim me clarified rather than confused. Each letter, each visit, each article became another stone in the wall I was building between their narrative and mine. They were escalating, yes, but so was I. I was escalating in my silence, in my refusal to answer their calls, in my decision to speak only when I chose and not when demanded. For the first time in decades, I was no longer begging for inclusion. I was granting it selectively. The second escalation was the testing ground of my strength. They pressed harder, and I discovered that I did not break. They shouted louder, and I realized I preferred the sound of my own quiet. They tried to summon me back into the cage, and I found that the door no longer fit around my shoulders. I had grown too large with truth. There comes a moment when endurance hardens into decision, when silence stops being a shield and becomes instead a prison of its own. And for me, that moment arrived quietly one afternoon, as I sat at my small kitchen table with their lawyer's letter spread before me, his words so careful and formal they almost sounded kind, telling me that my family wished only to ensure I was in a safe environment, and perhaps to begin conversations about next steps, as though my life were a project plan to be managed, as though I were not sitting there with my own pen poised, my own thoughts sharp as glass, my own will finally steady after months of trembling. I read the phrases again and again: concern for my well-being, discussion of assets, possible guardianship, each one a thin veil covering the truth. And when I set the paper down, I knew with absolute clarity that the time for hesitation had ended. I had spent too many years bending, folding, accommodating. waiting for them to remember I was human, and if I continued waiting, I would dissolve into the role they had written for me. The role of a vulnerable relic, grateful for whatever scraps of attention they offered. No, I told myself, not anymore. That evening, I pulled out a sheet of thick stationery, the kind I had saved from years back when people still wrote letters instead of sending hollow messages on glowing screens. And I wrote not to my son, not to my daughter-in-law, but to their lawyer, because I had learned that sometimes you must speak in the language your enemies respect, and theirs was the language of contracts and signatures. I wrote slowly, my hand steady, each word carved from the bedrock of my anger. To whom it may concern, there is no cause for further legal contact. I am of sound mind, in a safe environment, and not under duress. I have retained local legal counsel. Any further attempts to contact me under the guise of concern will be considered harassment. Sincerely, Martha Harlow. When I laid down the pen, I felt as though I had signed not just a letter, but a declaration of independence, my own revolution inked in black and final. But that was not enough. I needed to face them, not in person, because confrontation would only drag me back into their theater of manipulation, but in words that could not be twisted into their own narrative. So I wrote a second letter, this one to Lisa, and it was brief, no more than 3 lines, but it carried the weight of decades. I wrote, "I know what you did. I know what you didn't say. I'm not angry. I'm not coming back. Take care of your own life now. I finally started mine." I sealed the envelope without hesitation, and as I pressed the flap closed, I felt as though I had shut a door that had been standing open far too long, a door through which they had entered again and again to strip me of dignity. The act itself was simple: ink, paper, stamps. But the shift it created inside me was irreversible. I was no longer the woman tied to the radiator waiting for rescue. I was the woman who had untied herself with the sharp blade of decision. I was no longer the mother who hoped her son might remember the warmth of her sacrifices. I was the woman who accepted that memory could not be forced and love could not be begged. And most of all, I was no longer invisible. Not to myself. The following morning I walked to the post office, each step deliberate, and when I dropped the envelopes into the metal mouth of the box, I stood for a moment listening to the hollow clank as they disappeared, and I whispered to myself, "It is done." No one around me noticed. No one clapped or cheered. But I felt taller, straighter, as though my spine had remembered its strength. The streets looked different on the way home, not because they had changed, but because I had. The buildings seemed less oppressive, the air less heavy. The very act of walking was no longer a shuffle of obligation, but a stride of ownership. And yet, the climax was not only in those letters, but in the quiet decision that followed. I would live as though they no longer existed, not because I hated them, but because I refused to let their version of me dictate the rest of my days. When the phone buzzed later with another unknown number, I let it ring until it died. When a neighbor mentioned seeing Adam's face in the paper, I only smiled and said nothing. I had discovered a new kind of power, the power of refusal, and it thrilled me in a way I had not felt since youth. That night, as I stood before the mirror in my rented room, I touched my reflection with the tips of my fingers, tracing the lines of age, the softness of cheeks, the strength still visible in my jaw. And I said aloud, "You did it." The radiator, the rope, the whispers that I would not move. Those belonged to another chapter, one I had closed with ink and will. The woman in the mirror was not secured, not silenced, not erased. She was here, unbound, holding the pen that had rewritten her story. Peace did not descend on me like a sudden gift. It grew slowly, like ivy climbing the wall of a house, unnoticed day by day until one morning you look up and realize the whole surface has been softened by green. After the letters were sent and the silence between us became a permanent country, I found myself no longer waiting for the phone to ring or for the mail to arrive. The stillness that once frightened me began to feel like protection. And in that stillness, I rediscovered the sound of my own breath, the weight of my own steps, the rhythm of my own choices. For the first time in decades, I belonged wholly to myself. And though loneliness sometimes sat at the edge of my bed like an uninvited guest, it no longer terrified me, because I understood that being alone is not the same as being abandoned. Abandonment is when those you love make you invisible. Solitude, chosen and embraced, is when you make yourself visible to your own eyes again. I began to build a life not with grand gestures, but with ordinary rituals that tasted new simply because they were mine. I woke each morning and brewed coffee the way I liked it, strong and bitter, and drank it slowly by the window without anyone sighing about the mess or complaining about the smell. I walked to the library and volunteered to read to children, my voice steady as I carried stories into their small, waiting ears, and I saw in their faces a reflection of the young woman I once was, filled with possibility rather than erasure. I bought myself a navy coat from a second-hand shop, warm and solid, and when I slipped it on, I felt as though I had armored myself in dignity. These were not luxuries, they were reclamations, each one proof that I had not been destroyed, only delayed. Kieran wrote again, and this time I answered. Not to his parents, never to them, but to him, because he had always been different, his heart unclouded by the hunger for control. I told him only that I was safe, that I had begun a new life, and that one day, when the time was right, we would see each other again. He did not press for more. He only replied, "I'm glad you're okay." "I miss you." Those words were enough. A lifeline that connected me to the possibility of love without dragging me back into the pit of obligation. It reminded me that family is not always the people you are bound to by blood, but the ones who look at you and see, without condition, that you matter. Sometimes at night, when the radiator in my apartment hisses and the pipes groan, I place my hand on the wall and remember the cold bite of the cord, the humiliation of being treated like a piece of furniture, and I whisper to myself, never again. Not as a curse, not as a bitter mantra, but as a vow of self-recognition. The memory no longer paralyzes me. It strengthens me. It reminds me that survival is not only about breathing, but about refusing to surrender your voice to those who would silence it. Now, at 78, I sit on my porch in the evenings with a cup of tea and watch the sky bruise into dusk. The world passes by, buses grumble, neighbors call to each other, the bakery below closes its shutters, and I feel no need to be anywhere else. I have learned that freedom is not loud, not flashy. It is quiet, steady, an interior place where no one else has the right to bind you. I have learned that even at an age when society expects you to fade, you can still sharpen, still claim, still insist on being seen. And I have learned that sometimes the greatest act of defiance is simply to keep living on your own terms. If another woman like me is listening, perhaps sitting tonight in a room where her words are dismissed, where her needs are mocked, where her presence is treated as burden, I want to tell her this. You are not as powerless as they want you to. Believe you are not furniture. You are not a mistake. Even if they whisper that you will not move, you can, and you must. It will not be easy. It will not be without pain, but it will be yours, and that is enough. I was not rescued by family. I was not saved by pity. I was not carried out of darkness by anyone else's hand. I rescued myself the moment I decided that my silence was over. And though the scars remain, they are mine. And they remind me every day that I am still here, still breathing, still unbound. So that is my story, not of abandonment, but of release. I was tied once, but I am tied no longer. I was silenced once, but now I speak. And though I am nearing the end of my years, I live them not as a shadow, not as a burden, but as a woman who finally chose herself and who will never again wait for permission to move.